Hi, everyone. Happy Thursday, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Adam, and I'll be your moderator. Before we dive in, a few housekeeping reminders for you. Firstly, today's webinar is being recorded, and an email with the recording will be sent out to you. The console you're looking at is 100% customizable. Feel free to adjust the sizing of the boxes on screen to your liking. Please also feel free to use the attendee chat, as well as submit any questions for our speakers in the Q&A box. We've loaded some great content for you in the resources for you box. I highly encourage you checking them out before you leave the webinar. And lastly, if you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please clear your cache and or refresh your browser window. With that, I will throw it over to Seth.
Great, thank you so much. Looking forward to today's conversation. So my name is Seth Geftig. I'm the Vice President of Product Marketing here at Red Canary. I'm joined by one of our co-founders and our CTO, Chris Rothy. Chris is holed up in his home today, escaping the Denver Nuggets victory parade, which has closed down the office. So I'll apologize on his behalf for his blurred background. What we're going to talk about today are threats, right? Identity threats, cloud threats, and email threats. And why do we have an opinion on this at Red Canary? Well, as an MDR provider, we have a unique perspective here. Is we see all the threats that get past our customers' defenses, all the tools they have. We see what attackers are actually being successful at trying ways they've gotten into environments and the damage they're trying to incur when they get in there. Last year, we detected 40,000 confirmed medium and high severity threats. We outlined those all in our threat detection report, which is a great threat intelligence vendor neutral approach to learn about what threats we're seeing and practical ways you could actually respond to those without having to spend money. So we're going to go over some of those threats that we've seen at a macro level. I'll talk through some of those, and then Chris will go through some specific examples of the ones that we see most often or giving organizations the hardest time. And the good news is the story here, just because we're talking about cloud, email, it doesn't really matter in much as it's the same story we've been telling for many years, which is attackers are able to compromise parts of our account, often the identities of our users. And from there, they can go into cloud, SaaS applications, corporate environments, endpoints, things like that. So their way in is very similar. And their means of doing so and their goals are very similar, which is get in by stealing your credentials, compromising your endpoints, could be getting into your cloud infrastructure. But the goal is always to make money, right? I want to steal data. I want to exfiltrate data, perhaps to bribe organizations, perhaps to resell that on the black market, perhaps for espionage reasons. I want to do ransomware because ransomware has always been the moneymaker. Crypto mining is probably the other one I would add that's specific to cloud environments. Chris will talk about that a bit, but it's very simple, right? The how you get out in terms of the attackers, like what they do with their access, in a lot of ways is less important than the fact that they have access. And as defenders, that's what we're focusing on. We're focusing on that initial access, the reconnaissance, and the lateral movement. How did the attackers get in the environment? Where did they go once they got in there, and what were they trying to do? Because once we get to exfiltration and encryption, really the game's, it's a little too late at that point. And as we think through cloud identity email threats, while we're interested in the avoid this part, like the outcomes of those, often the beginning stages are very similar to the beginning stages we would see historically on an endpoint or a network environment. So our recommendations before we jump into the specific threats are pretty high level. First, when you think about your identities, make sure you protect that. Everything from identity and access control tools to making sure those identities are monitored, along with cloud and email threats. So constantly have eyes on glass looking in those areas, and that has to be 24/7, 365. Attackers don't sleep, they don't go on vacation, they don't watch the Denver Nuggets win the NBA championship. They care more about making money and stealing your money. So it has to have 24/7 monitoring, and there's ways that organizations like ours can help with that. And then when something bad does occur, have a plan to respond. So that both means practicing the plan, defining the plan, and having tools at your disposal so your team can move quickly to reduce that mean time to respond. So with that, let's talk about the specific threats. I'll hand it over to Chris, and he'll start with the cloud environments.
Yeah, thanks, Seth. When we think about cloud environments and sort of the context Seth laid out of initial access and then action on objectives, to use some old terminology. Let's start by thinking about initial access. There's kind of two main ways that an adversary can get into a cloud environment. We've got the control plane, whether that be AWS, Azure, GCP, by which an adversary can get credentials, whether that's a login or its API keys, access keys, get in and do harm there, get to their objectives. The other is through the workloads. So those being sort of the normal instances, Kubernetes clusters, containers, et cetera, and compromises that can happen there. The third would be web applications and being able to compromise and get in through there. So those are the primary means of initial access. Now, how they come about those capabilities or those credentials required to do that can come in a bunch of different flavors. So very often access keys get left in GitHub repos that are public, things like that, where there's an accidental leak of those keys. Now an adversary finds it, they discover that they can get in, now they're there. On the more malicious side, we see a lot of things relating to phishing and trying to steal the access into the cloud control plane, as well as cloud token theft and things like that. I'm getting a notification my signal is weak here, so I'm actually going to kill my camera just so that hopefully y'all can see me. I don't know how to do that. We'll go with this. All right, so let's talk about what the types of threats are in terms of how adversaries target the cloud environment. We talked about credential theft. There's also lots of ways to brute force the logins to try to get into the cloud control plane. Cloud token theft, man-in-the-middling the access that one of your legitimate users has, and then using that token to do whatever they want, abusing the APIs, and probably the biggest thing, finding misconfigurations. A lot of times when developers are building stuff in the cloud, they get to a point where they're like, you know what, I can't figure out why thing X can't talk to thing Y, just make it world open, make it open in both directions, make the user trying to be the account used between them have God mode, and then it starts working and they say, hey, cool, let's move on. So those types of misconfigurations are prevalent in the cloud and something that adversaries love to take advantage of. Curious from the audience, like what anyone, any of these that are most concerning. I'll leave this up for just a second. We don't have any of these, like all of them are concerning and all of them are a means to get in and drive towards those objectives that we'll talk about in a second. But very curious to hear from the audience as to what is most concerning in your cloud environments. All right. Here we go. Credential theft. Well, that's pretty definitive. Yeah, that's obviously with stolen credentials, someone can do anything they want with your cloud environment. So let's talk about some of the things we've seen people do in those cloud environments. One pretty common thing that we've seen a bunch of times in our customer environments is that man-in-the-middling of a session token, and then using that token to modify access rules for S3 buckets. So in this case, the adversary got access to this environment, didn't have to actually log in. They just reused access that was already granted to a user or to a access role, and then leverage that to make that change. Once that bucket's public, now they can go in as any user and grab data out of it. Pretty simple attack on the surface, but once they get in, once they're able to brute force, man in the middle of that session token, they can do all kinds of different things and do this really quickly. It takes mere seconds to do this, find the bucket that you want to target, enumerate those buckets, change the access to public, grab the data out, and they're gone. Another example we see a lot, similar starting point. So intercepting that token, getting in, creating a user account for themselves, and then leveraging that to be able to spin up maybe thousands of instances in the cloud, maybe GPU instances, and then do silly things like crypto mining. One really extreme example we saw ended up being like $100,000 bill for the user to mine, $600 or $700 worth of some cryptocurrency. The adversary doesn't care. They're not paying the bill for the cloud infrastructure, and you get to pay that later on in the month while they get to run away with the $800. That's, the cloud has this incredible ability to be elastic and expand and contract. And that's something that we're seeing increasingly that adversaries are taking advantage of. It's kind of an interesting way to think about it. They don't need to steal your money anymore, right? They don't need to sell your data to make money. They can just leverage your infrastructure to make money, and then you pay the utility fee for it effectively. So that's just a whirlwind tour of a few cloud threats that we see. Shifting gears a little bit, we'll talk a little bit about identity and then email threats. So adversaries are definitely targeting your users as well. There's a whole bunch of different ways they try to get there, be that trying to social engineer them and steal credentials, brute forcing them. We'll talk about MFA exhaustion in a second, and ultimately trying to get to a point where they can take over accounts and or leverage your email infrastructure to do harm. Leave this up here. There's none of these are particularly new, especially when we talk about BEC. BEC's been sort of the bane of security teams' existence for a number of years now. Been many high-profile cases, but certainly we haven't been able to create enough controls and enough stuff in place to shut that down entirely as of yet. And I don't know that there ever will be a way to do that. So BEC is the one that stands out to me, but curious to see what anybody else thinks. Hey, look at that. I was half right. Yeah, so absolutely. And we've got a couple examples here to talk about those too. So let's talk MFA exhaustion really quick. So the concept here, if you're not familiar, is bombing a user with many MFA requests until the point where they just get bored of saying no to them or ignoring them, and they say yes to try to make it go away. Once an adversary has done that, they've bypassed your MFA. They may or may not be able to use that to access a resource initially, but they can poke around and figure out what other pieces of your infrastructure they can get access to. One of the reasons why this is so successful in using MFA requests or MFA request generation is that you can mix it with other social engineering techniques, right? Make it look very authentic and feel like it's coming from a trusted place. Attach urgency to it, make it seem like, hey, this really needs to happen right now. And you can also hit it from a bunch of different angles, whether that's push notifications, phone calls, email, text. This is all like convenient stuff that we've built into our MFA tools, but can be leveraged as a way to get a user to do something that we want them to. Some recommendations here on how to do MFA better. First up, like number matching is a little bit better than just straight push the button type MFA. So if the user has to do one more thing, that gives them a little bit more time to think about whether this is a legitimate request and whether they should actually accept it and move forward. When we think about phish resistance MFA, that's tying authentication to a hardware device or something specific. There's lots of different forms of this, but increasing the level by just a little bit, making it a little bit harder and saying like, no, the authentication request has to come from trusted hardware. And then, as we start to move towards zero trust or beyond corp or whatever, your favorite name for it is, being able to really create conditional access that says, not only are we going to force an MFA, but we're also going to ensure that the device doing the MFA is locked down and that the access is coming from a legitimate device that also has our security controls in place. You can block legacy protocols, all that kind of stuff. So that's probably about as good as you can do today by creating conditional access on top of some really resilient multi-factor authentication. And then beyond that, when we talk about how we might detect these types of threats in the identity space, Okta has the system log. If you're using Okta, if we're talking about logins to AWS, CloudTrail, there would be a similar thing in Azure and GCP. Azure Active Directory has the audit log. Do authentication, the proxy log there is kind of your source. So depending on what your identity provider is, monitoring those and looking for signs of unusual logins, looking for suspicious travel, like impossible travel type alerts that a lot of these systems will notice. weird time frames associated with users, those types of analytics. And then being able to trace that back and figure out exactly what the adversary was trying to get to. Shifting gears just a little bit to talk about email accounts. Big joke inside of Red Canary is, why our CEO, Brian, has such a large appetite for gift cards. I'm sure we're all getting these all the time. Trying to create urgency. Hey, I really need you to do this right now in this meeting, need it to happen now. Techniques that we're all fairly familiar with. Some things we see adversaries using all the time with typo squatting, domain spoofing, et cetera, to, again, try to raise the authenticity level. Definitely expect that to get better and better as adversaries start to use generative AI to make their requests look even more authentic, get rid of spelling issues and grammatical issues, or even impersonate people. So that's a huge threat in a big way that BEC happens. And then once an account takeover is there, then the adversary can do all kinds of things. One thing we see all the time is payroll fraud, getting access to an email account, interacting with HR payroll from there to change direct deposit information. Lots of different fun things that adversaries can do in that perspective, but that's one that they love to do, to try to just get direct access to dollars. Just to kind of spell out the example, an account takeover example, like get access to some email inbox, then use inbox rules to conceal the presence. So the idea there is we want to hide our communications if we're the bad guy. So anything that hits the inbox, let's make sure it doesn't show up to the user, and instead gets pushed over into some weird folder that not everybody's looking at, and then impersonate that employee, use their identity to communicate with whoever to steal money or do whatever their goal is. Pretty common thing, pretty simple. Once the adversary has found a way to get into that inbox, whether that was through social engineering, phishing, etc. Here's what that might look like. This is a screenshot from a Red Canary threat that we detected. So you can see in the top left some bizarrely named email rule created by a real person, name changed to protect them here. But the point is, it looks like it was created by the actual user. That's our sign that someone has compromised this email account and they're acting like the actual user. Near the bottom, you can see what the rule was. So they're basically saying, hey, anything that comes from the finance guy, move it over into this RSS feeds folder. This is a neat tactic adversaries like to use is, RSS feeds may not even stand out as like, oh, that's a weirdly named folder. Like it's just sitting there. Like maybe we all have an RSS feeds folder, but it's unlikely for that the user's actually going to be poking around in there and paying attention to it. So now they're able to just contain their communication to that folder. So detecting this type of email rule creation, really valuable, really effective way to detect this type of email compromise. So like I said, monitor for the creation of suspicious rules, especially as it relates to very strange folders. And then if we can, monitor that for weird strings in the subject lines and headers of email communication. Payroll, invoice, anything related to dollars and cents seems to be where we can find things and then communicate with the users to make sure they're legitimate. All right, so just to kind of sum up what you can do, if you haven't, and I can't imagine anybody hasn't yet, but definitely implementing multi-factor authentication and making sure it's resistant to phishing and other types of attacks. Have a preference for something that adds a little bit more time to the process. We don't want to slow the users down, but we do want to give them that extra half beat to make sure that what they're approving is a legitimate thing. And then definitely conditional access policies and device trust. Those are hard projects, but if we can push that rock uphill, we can definitely limit the amount of access adversaries can gain. And then beyond that, the detection and response capabilities centered around identity, both for the cloud, for your SaaS and email type systems are important as well. And then we definitely would recommend do some testing. If you're not familiar with the Atomic Red team, go check that out. There's a large array of tests that you can do both for endpoints, but into the identity space to test yourself and try to figure out, hey, if an adversary did this, would we see it? So those would be our main recommendations. And I'll hand it back to Seth to talk about kind of how we can help.
Thanks, Chris. So when you think about what you can do, there's always going to be a limitation. And good MDR provider like Red Canary can really help broaden your security operations profile and help you do things like 24 investigation of potential threats. So even large, sophisticated organizations struggle to give 24/7 coverage in their environment, or the coverage is significantly weaker in off hours than it is during their core business hours. Almost every MDR provider is going to be 24/7 and give you that peace of mind around the clock. But going beyond that, one of the things that we can do as well is advanced threat detection. So in addition to looking at what your security tools are detecting, essentially your alerts, we're taking the data from those security tools and saying, what else is out there? What are these tools missing? What cloud threats, email threats, and identity threats are slipping past our controls that our security team needs to be aware of? That's where we can help as well. We also have our own internal threat intelligence team, and that's really valuable for you. Again, most organizations do not have threat intelligence as an in-house capability. They rely on third parties to provide that intelligence for them. And that's something we would do, both letting you know what the latest and greatest threats are, how to respond to those, how to harden your environment against them, but also tuning your security operations program to ensure that you're protected against those, either proactively or reactively in the case where it's a new threat. We'll provide continuous threat hunting, constantly poking around your environment to determine if there's adversaries lurking there that otherwise we're going unnoticed. And then when we do find something, 24/7 response and remediation. So regardless of the time, regardless of the type of threat, we would be there to help you remediate that threat and evict the adversary from your environment. And we deliver that everywhere. So not just on your cloud and for your users, on your endpoints as well. So we have organizations that work with Red Canary that are endpoint protection only. We have organizations that mix and match the type of protection. And we have many, many organizations that utilize cloud protection, user protection, endpoint protection. So think about what threats you're most concerned about. Think about where your security team has gaps today, and we can help fill in those gaps for you. So how do we do that? Well, it's pretty simple. First, we take in data from the tools you already own. So you don't have to buy new security tools, but we take the data, the alerts, and the telemetry from your cloud tools. Those are your cloud control planes, your identity tools. So that would be everything like identity access management, authenticators, email providers, endpoints. So like your EDR, XDR tools, your networks, think your NDR, your firewalls, and many, many more tools. We'll ingest those into our environment. And then with that data, we're able to hunt for threats. We're able to see all the alerts that you're getting and triage them for you. So you don't have to worry about all those false positives. We'll take care of those, and we'll tell you which of the alerts actually matter. When we see some suspicious activity, we'll investigate that on your behalf, and then we'll present the results from all those disparate tools we collected data from in a unified timeline. So you not just have the, hey, here's what we found, but the broad context around it to say, how did the adversary get in? What were they trying to do, and what do we need to do about it? And then we help you with that response through a variety of both human-led and automated response options. We either can guide you on your response or take care of it on your behalf. So what does that mean for you? That means in the past where you might have been overwhelmed with the amount of alerts that you're getting from all these security tools. So security tools are great, but they're very, very noisy. I'd ask how many of them are, what's the false positive percentage? Usually it's in the 80 or 90% range. So what do teams do about that? They do one of two things: either burn themselves out trying to chase every single alert from every tool that they've invested in. And that's a recipe for team members leaving and missing the forest through the trees because you're so focused on all those alerts. Or they end up ignoring these tools you've spent a lot of money for, spent a lot of time setting up in your environment, but because they're noisy, you tend to not believe the data coming out of it. With Red Canary, you'll be focused and you'll be effective. So we'll do all that heavy lifting for your team. We'll take care of all of the alerts that don't matter. We'll find threats in your environment that those tools were missing in the first place, giving you the ability to detect more than you could on your own, respond faster than you ever could before, and make your team more efficient by focusing on the things that they really need to focus on. The next thing we will do is help you with coverage. So most organizations struggle to get full visibility in their environment. So that's both 24/7 visibility, but also because of tool sprawl and the lack of bandwidth or expertise in the team, it's usually hard to stay on top of your environment. With Red Canary, it's 24/7, 365 coverage around the clock of your cloud, your endpoints, your network tools, your identity tools, your email, and more. And then one of the biggest problems we've talked about, it feels like for a decade in this industry, is talent shortage and experience gaps. Every team struggles to hire, train, and retain really smart people, and it's really cost prohibitive. So with Red Canary, you'll get more expertise from some of the leading threat intel providers, detection engineers, and threat hunters in the world without having to hire a single internal person. And what's great about that is we give you full access to all of those teams. So unlimited access to all of our subject matter experts whenever you need to talk to them about whatever subject with no additional fees. On the cloud side, we're going to protect your cloud environment. Literally yesterday, we had a new announcement about new capabilities we developed on AWS CloudTrail and Amazon Guard Duty. So we're taking data from those tools and using it to hunt in your environment to find cloud threats that, again, otherwise would slip past those defenses. We then also have our own set of advanced analytics that we've applied to a variety of cloud data from Amazon, Azure, Google, Lacework, many others, where we'll look at the data coming from those tools and either use that to find threats or use that to put the threats into context with the other things that we've looked at. And we even provide coverage of your Linux production environment. So we have our own Linux EDR agent. It's the only agent we need, we ever utilize. But if you do not have coverage of your Linux production environments, we can provide an EDR tool that will help us monitor those environments on your behalf as well. On the user side, it's very similar. Like we're looking at your customers, your employees' identities to stop account takeovers. So 24/7 detection, investigation of any suspicious activity we see from a variety of platforms like Microsoft 365 and G Suite. We also prevent business email compromise, something we've seen a huge increase of. That's something outlined in our recent threat detection report. So the goal there is to stop those attacks before data is exfiltrated, before fraud's committed, before they're able to really take advantage of the foothold they have in the environment. And again, once we find whether it be a cloud threat, user threat, endpoint threat, we're going to help quickly remediate that. In the user's case, it's going to be suspending users, forcing reauthentication, and a variety of other actions that we can take to eject or frustrate the adversary. So what makes us different? So there's a few things that make Red Canary really unique. The first is the technology we have is unmatched in the industry. About a month ago, maybe less, Forrester had their most recent wave for managed detection and response. We were one of 3 leaders listed in that wave. And the highlight for Red Canary in that report, the headline that they talked about is how we are the industry leaders at detection engineering. So taking information from all of these tools and using it to find threats that were lurking in your environment that could have been there a while that would otherwise go unnoticed. And that's all using behavioral analytics applied to both the alerts we look at as well as the raw telemetry. So we take in petabytes of telemetry, no additional cost to you, in order to make sure we have full visibility and context of what's going on. Once we find something, one of our other advantages is our robust response capabilities. So both human-led and a pretty impressive, robust set of automated capabilities using our own internal SOAR tool that you can take advantage of to build automated playbooks. Great thing about that, it doesn't take any time, which means that you're both fast and also not adding to more resource constraints in your team. The other advantage we have is our coverage. So we combat tool sprawl by having coverage across your endpoints, your networks, your cloud, your identity, your email, and beyond, and take all that information and bring it back together in the end before we present it to you. So whereas today you have disparate tools, we'll take all those disparate tools and put them in context by presenting them in a unified timeline. And last but not least is we're a real security ally, meaning our main focus is delivering security outcomes for you and your team. So there's things that we just don't do. We don't charge extra for access to our subject matter experts. So if you want to speak to someone on the threat intelligence team, you can do that whenever you want at no additional cost. Because our goal here is to make sure that you have the best experience with Red Canary and have the most up-to-date security operations program that we can help you with. So with that, I think on Chris's behalf, thank you all for your time today. Good questions. Thank you for your interest. If you're interested in a demo, please go to redcanary.com. We also have our threat detection report there. And we have a lot more information about our cloud protection, our user protection, and our identity protection there as well. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks for joining.